My people, the hour of destiny is upon us. I shall lead us to victory.
All your subjects, hear me
In
now.
the cold
Our kingdom's
stone
strength
corridors
rests
of
on
the
your
Tower of
obedience.
London,
Rise and
where
serve your...
shadows stretch long and secrets echo through centuries, there are whispers of a passion so dangerous it nearly destroyed a kingdom. This is not a tale of romance. This is a story of obsession, manipulation, and the catastrophic collision of desire and power. In the year 1200, when kings ruled by divine right and marriage was the currency of empires, one man's fixation on a woman half his age would ignite wars, shatter alliances, and set in motion events that would culminate in one of the most significant political revolutions in English history. This is the story of King John of England and Isabella of Angoulême, a royal affair that was sealed not in love, but in the darkness of political ruthlessness and unquenchable hunger for control. England at the turn of the 13th century was a realm teetering on the edge of chaos. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had brought both glory and bloodshed to the throne, was entering one of its most turbulent periods. And at the center of this storm stood a king whose very name would become synonymous with tyranny, failure, and treachery. King John, youngest son of the legendary Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, ascended to the English throne in 1199 after the death of his brother, Richard the Lionheart. But John was no Richard. Where his brother had been a warrior king, celebrated across Christendom for his courage and military prowess, John was viewed with suspicion and contempt. He was a man of contradictions, intelligent yet paranoid, capable yet cruel, ambitious yet deeply insecure. John's reputation had been forged long before he wore the crown. As the youngest of Henry's legitimate sons, he had been nicknamed Lackland because his father had initially left him no territorial inheritance. This early humiliation bred in him a desperate need to prove himself, to accumulate power, to control everything
Father,
within his grasp.
Yes,
His
I will
subjects
protect
whispered that he was
But the soldiers-
untrustworthy,
Come, we must move.
that he had betrayed his own father and conspired against his brother during the Crusades. The nobility viewed him as a usurper who had possibly murdered his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, to secure his claim to the throne. The church regarded him with barely concealed hostility, and the common people simply feared him. But if John's political position was precarious, his personal life was equally complicated. In 1189, he had been married to Isabella of Gloucester, a union arranged purely for political advantage. The marriage granted John valuable lands and revenues, but it was a hollow partnership devoid of affection or even basic compatibility. By most accounts, John found his wife dull and uninspiring. She bore him no children, and as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that this marriage served no purpose beyond the accumulation of property. John needed more. He needed an alliance that would strengthen his position in France, where he held vast territories as a vassal of the French king. He needed a wife who would bear him heirs. But more than anything, John
My queen,
wanted
you honor us
something
all.
or someone
My king, it is my
that would
duty and
feed
my
his
joy.
insatiable
And mine to
appetite
share
for
it.
possession and control. That someone was Isabella of Angoulême. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, we must first understand who Isabella was and why she became the object of such dangerous desire. In the year 1200, Isabella was approximately 12 years old, though some chronicles suggest she may have been as young as 10 or as old as 14. Exact birth dates for medieval noblewomen were rarely recorded with precision. But what is certain is that she was a child by modern standards, yet considered marriageable by the customs of her time. She was the only daughter and heir of Aymer, Count of Angoulême, a strategically vital region in southwestern France that sat between John's territories of Aquitaine and Poitou. Isabella's importance was not merely genealogical. Angoulême controlled crucial trade routes and castles that formed a defensive barrier in the complex web of feudal allegiances that characterized medieval France. Whoever married Isabella would gain not only her lands, but also a foothold in the ongoing power struggle between the English Plantagenets and the French Capetians.
The alliance
And Isabella
must hold.
herself,
The cost is
according
too
to
high.
contemporary
We have no
accounts,
choice.
possessed a beauty that was remarkable even in an age when physical appearance was frequently exaggerated in courtly literature. She was described as having fair skin, dark eyes that seemed to hold mysteries beyond her years, and a bearing that suggested both innocence and an almost unsettling self-possession. But Isabella was not unattached. She had been betrothed since childhood to Hugh de Lusignan, known as Hugh the Brown, a powerful nobleman from one of the most influential families in the region. The Lusignans were formidable players in the political landscape of western France, commanding extensive lands, numerous castles, and the loyalty of countless knights. The betrothal between Hugh and Isabella had been carefully negotiated to unite two powerful families and create a block of territory that could counterbalance both English and French royal influence. The marriage was expected to take place as soon as Isabella reached a suitable age. It was a done deal, sealed by contracts, witnessed by nobles, and blessed by the church. Then King John arrived in Angoulême in the summer of 1200, and everything
My troth
changed.
to thee.
What
And I
transpired
pledge
during
mine
those
to
summer
thee.
months
May this union
remains
be blessed.
shrouded in historical ambiguity, but the essential facts are clear. John met Isabella, and he became obsessed. Whether this obsession was rooted in genuine attraction, political calculation, or simply his pathological need to possess what belonged to others is impossible to determine with certainty. What we do know is that John, a man of 33 years, fixated on this child bride with an intensity that alarmed even his own advisors. He did not merely desire to ally himself with Angoulême. He desired Isabella herself, and he was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The traditional narrative suggests that John was captivated by Isabella's beauty, that he saw her and fell into a passion so consuming that it overrode his political judgment. But this romantic interpretation obscures a darker truth. For John, Isabella represented everything he craved: youth, beauty, valuable territory, and perhaps most intoxicating of all, something that had been promised to another man. She was forbidden fruit, and John had built his entire life around taking what was forbidden. The method by which John acquired Isabella reveals the true nature of this royal affair. He did not court her family through patient negotiation. He did not offer a better alliance or wait for the Lusignan betrothal to be dissolved through proper channels. Instead, he employed a combination of political pressure, legal manipulation, and barely veiled threats. John approached Isabella's father, Count Aymer, with an offer that was impossible to refuse, not because it was generous, but because refusal would mean destruction. John was not merely a suitor. He was the King of England, Duke of Normandy, and overlord of vast territories in France. He commanded armies. He controlled trade. He could make or break a family with a single decree. Under enormous pressure, Count Aymer agreed to break his daughter's betrothal to Hugh de Lusignan and give her instead to King John. The speed with which this happened suggests that consent was given more out of fear than enthusiasm. Within weeks of meeting Isabella, John had obtained an annulment of his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester on the grounds of consanguinity, a convenient excuse the medieval church frequently permitted for politically motivated
My lords, we
marriages.
stand united.
On August 24,
Indeed, our alliance
1200,
is forged.
in the city of Angoulême, John married Isabella. She became Queen of England before she had even reached puberty. The ceremony was rushed, almost furtive, as if John feared that any delay might allow someone to intervene. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Hugh de Lusignan, the jilted fiancé, was not merely disappointed. He was publicly humiliated and politically undermined. In the feudal society of medieval Europe, such an insult could not be tolerated. A betrothal was a sacred contract, and to break it so cavalierly was to declare that agreements meant nothing, that power trumped honor, that a king could simply take what he wanted regardless of law or custom. Hugh, along with his extensive family network, appealed to King Philip Augustus of France, John's feudal overlord for his French territories. They demanded justice. They demanded restitution. And when neither was forthcoming, they demanded war. Philip Augustus, ever the shrewd politician, saw his opportunity. He had long chafed under the reality that his nominal vassal, the King of England, controlled more
castle
territory
endures,
in
but the enemy
France
presses
than he did
hard.
himself.
Father, the smoke!
The
It
Lusignan
grows
complaint gave Philip the legal pretext he needed to move against John. In 1202, Philip summoned John to his court to answer for his actions regarding Isabella and the Lusignans. John, recognizing this as a trap, refused to attend. Philip declared John a contumacious vassal and pronounced his French territories forfeit. The war that followed would last for years and result in John losing nearly all his continental possessions, including Normandy, Anjou, and much of Aquitaine. In the span of a few years, the vast Angevin Empire that John's father had built was reduced to a fraction of its former size. But while armies clashed and territories changed hands, John's obsession with Isabella only intensified. Contemporary chronicles describe a king who was utterly consumed by his young bride, spending hours, even days, in her chambers while matters of state languished unattended. One chronicler wrote with barely concealed disgust that John would remain in bed with Isabella until midday while his kingdom collapsed around him. Another described how the king seemed enchanted by her, as if she had cast some spell over him. Whether Isabella encouraged this attention,
My lords and ladies, I stand before you as your sovereign.
or actively
Together we
despised
shall forge a
we
prosperous...
cannot know with certainty. She was, after all, a child married to a man old enough to be her father, a foreigner in a hostile court, a queen with no real power except what her husband's obsession granted her. The affair, if we can call it that, was marked not by tenderness, but by possession. John was notoriously jealous, surrounding Isabella with guards and spies, monitoring her every interaction, suspicious of any man who came near her. There are accounts of John publicly humiliating nobles whom he suspected of showing too much interest in his queen. This was not love. This was ownership. Isabella was a prize, a trophy, and John's treatment of her reflected his fundamental inability to distinguish between political acquisition and personal relationship. As the military situation deteriorated, the darkness of John's character became ever more apparent. In 1203, Arthur of Brittany, John's teenage nephew and rival for the throne, was captured during the conflict with France. Arthur was imprisoned in the castle of Rouen, and then he disappeared. Rumors spread like wildfire throughout Europe
My lord,
that John
is the
had
realm
personally
secure?
murdered the boy,
It is, your grace. Our knights are
either
vigilant.
strangling
And the
him
people,
in a
do they
drunken
trust
rage or ordering him to be castrated and blinded before being thrown into the Seine River. No body was ever found. No official explanation was ever given. But the suspicion was enough. Whatever remaining loyalty John's French vassals felt evaporated. Castles opened their gates to Philip Augustus. Knights switched allegiances. By 1204, Normandy, the ancestral heartland of John's dynasty, was lost. Back in England, the situation was scarcely better. The treasury was depleted by constant warfare. John imposed punishing taxes on his barons to fund his military campaigns that seemed designed more to satisfy his ego than to achieve realistic strategic objectives. He demanded scutage, a payment in lieu of military service, at unprecedented levels and with unprecedented frequency. He manipulated the justice system to extract fines and fees. He took hostages from noble families to ensure their loyalty, including children whom he kept in conditions that amounted to imprisonment. And always, there were whispers about Isabella, about the king's unnatural fixation on his child bride, about how he neglected his kingdom for the sake of his obsession. Isabella herself bore John 5 children over the course of their marriage: Henry, Richard, Joan, Isabella, and Eleanor. The fact that she was giving birth to royal heirs by the time she was 16 or 17 years old reminds us of the brutal realities of medieval marriage. But the production of children did nothing to stabilize John's reign. If anything, his behavior became more erratic. He grew paranoid, trusting no one, seeing conspiracies everywhere. He quarreled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, resulting in England being placed under interdict in 1208, meaning that most church services were suspended. This was not merely a spiritual catastrophe, but a political one, as it delegitimized John's rule in the eyes of his Christian subjects. The Tower of London, that ancient fortress on the Thames, became central to John's strategy of control through fear. It was here that he kept his most valuable prisoners, his most dangerous enemies, his most closely guarded secrets. Noble hostages languished in its cells. Enemies of the crown disappeared into its depths. And it was here, according to some accounts, that Isabella herself was occasionally confined, whether for her protection or to keep her isolated from potential conspirators, we cannot say with certainty. The tower became a symbol of John's reign. Cold, impenetrable, built to withstand siege, a place where secrets were sealed away forever. By 1214, John's position had become untenable. His attempt to reclaim his lost French territories ended in catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, where his allies were crushed by Philip Augustus. The loss was total and humiliating. John returned to England with nothing to show for years of taxation, military requisition, and political manipulation except debt, resentment, and a kingdom on the brink of rebellion. The barons, who had suffered under John's arbitrary rule for 15 years, finally reached their breaking point. They were not merely angry about taxes or military failures. They were angry about the fundamental nature of John's kingship, his refusal to govern
subjects, I stand
according
before
to
you today to
established
reaffirm
law
our
and
sacred
custom.
bonds. Let
His
us march
treatment of
forward,
them
united in
as subjects to be exploited rather than partners in rule. In January 1215, a group of barons confronted John and demanded that he confirm the traditional liberties that earlier kings had granted. John, always the calculating survivor, agreed to negotiate. But negotiation is not the same as capitulation, and John had no intention of genuinely limiting his power. Through the spring of 1215, tensions escalated. In May, the rebel barons renounced their allegiance to John and elected their own leader, effectively declaring civil war. John's support crumbled. Even his own mercenary captains began to question whether he could pay them. Desperate and isolated, John had no choice but to agree to the terms the barons demanded. On June 15, 1215, in a meadow beside the Thames at Runnymede, King John affixed his seal to a document that would become known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was a revolutionary moment in the history of governance, establishing for the first time in England the principle that the king himself was subject to law, that royal power was not absolute, that there were certain rights and liberties that even a monarch could not arbitrarily violate. Among its clauses were protections against unlawful imprisonment, guarantees of due process, restrictions on taxation, and assurances that the church would remain free from royal interference. But while historians celebrate Magna Carta as a foundational document of liberty and the rule of law, we must remember what brought England to this point. It was not merely political incompetence or military failure. It was the personal obsession of a king who valued his own desires above the welfare of his kingdom, who pursued a child bride with such reckless fixation that he destroyed alliances, provoked wars, alienated his subjects, and ultimately fractured the very foundations of his rule. Isabella was both the symbol and the catalyst of John's downfall. She represented his inability to distinguish between possession and governance, between desire and duty. John never intended to honor Magna Carta. Within weeks, he appealed to Pope Innocent III to annul it, and the Pope, seeing the charter as an unlawful restriction on royal authority, obliged. England descended into open civil war. The rebel barons, desperate for a leader who could actually defeat John's
Knights of the realm, our
armies,
courage will shatter the
invited
darkness.
Prince Louis of France to invade
Victory
and
is
take the English throne. For more than a year, England was torn apart by warfare between royalist and rebel forces. Castles changed hands. Entire regions were devastated. And through it all, John fought with the desperate energy of a man who had nothing left to lose. Then, in October 1216, while campaigning in the east of England, John contracted dysentery. Weakened by illness and perhaps by the weight of his failures, he died at Newark Castle on the night of October 18th and 19th, 1216. He was 49 years old. His body was buried at Worcester Cathedral, but even in death, John could not escape controversy. His tomb was modest, his funeral poorly attended, his legacy contested. He left behind a kingdom in chaos, a war unresolved, and a reputation as one of the worst kings in English history. And Isabella? At the time of John's death, she was approximately 28 years old. She had been Queen of England for 16 years, married to a man she almost certainly never loved, a mother 5 times over, and a witness to the collapse of an empire. With John dead, Isabella's position became precarious. Her stepson, the 9-year-old Henry III, was crowned king, but he was a child, and England was still at war. Isabella had no role in the regency government that was established to rule in Henry's name. She was a foreign queen, still viewed with suspicion by English nobles who blamed her marriage to John for much of the disaster that had befallen the kingdom. In 1217, Isabella made a choice that shocked everyone. She returned to France and promptly married her first fiancé, Hugh de Lusignan, the very man whose betrothal John had broken 17 years earlier. It was an extraordinary turn of events, almost poetic in its circularity. The woman who had been the cause of so much conflict between the Lusignans and the English crown now united herself with the family that had been her husband's greatest enemies in France. Whether this marriage was motivated by love, political calculation, or simple pragmatism, we cannot know. But it suggests that Isabella possessed a talent for survival and a capacity for agency that the historical record, which portrays her primarily as an object of male desire and political maneuvering, rarely acknowledges. Isabella lived for another 29 years after John's death, bearing 9 more children to Hugh de Lusignan and involving herself deeply in the politics of southwestern France. She died in 1246 at the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had taken the habit of a nun in her final years. She was buried there, in the same royal necropolis where Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's mother, and other members of the Plantagenet dynasty were interred. It was a quiet end for a woman whose marriage had reshaped the political landscape of medieval Europe. But the secrets of that marriage, the full truth of what transpired between John and Isabella in the private chambers of their castles and in the cold corridors of the Tower, remain sealed. We have the public record, the broken betrothal, the hasty marriage, the wars that followed, the loss of empire, the rebellion of the barons, and the creation of Magna Carta. But we do not have Isabella's voice. We do not know whether she was complicit in John's obsession or merely its victim. We do not know if she encouraged his jealousy or despised him for it. We do not know whether their relationship evolved over 16 years into something resembling partnership or remained forever defined by the power imbalance of that first encounter in Angoulême. What we do know is that John's pursuit of Isabella was not an aberration, but a reflection of his fundamental character. He was a man who believed that desire justified any action, that power meant the freedom to take what he wanted regardless of the consequences. He broke a betrothal because he could. He alienated powerful families because his obsession mattered more than political wisdom. He allowed his kingdom to descend into chaos because his fixation on a young girl was more important than the welfare of his subjects. And in the end, that obsession contributed directly to the circumstances that produced Magna Carta, one of the most important constitutional documents in the history of the English-speaking world. The Tower of London still stands, as it has for nearly 1,000 years, a monument to power, imprisonment, and the secrets of the crown. Within its walls, countless prisoners have languished, countless plots have been hatched, and countless secrets have been sealed away forever. The story of King John and Isabella of Angoulême is one of those secrets, a tale of obsession, manipulation, and the catastrophic consequences of mistaking possession for love. It is a reminder that even in an age of absolute monarchy, there were limits to royal power, limits that were discovered only when a king's personal desires became so destructive that they threatened the very fabric of the realm. This was not a love story. This was not a romance between a king and his beautiful queen. This was an affair in the truest sense of the word, a matter of state, a source of conflict, a catalyst for war and revolution. It was an affair sealed in the Tower, locked away in the dark cells where John kept his enemies and his secrets, buried in the historical record beneath layers of propaganda, rumor, and deliberate obscurity. And it reminds us that the private desires of the powerful are never truly private, that obsession unchecked by wisdom or compassion can reshape nations, and that sometimes the most significant moments in history are born not from grand ideals, but from the base impulses of flawed and dangerous men. The legacy of King John and Isabella of Angoulême is written not in love letters or romantic poetry, but in the clauses of Magna Carta, in the lost territories of the Angevin Empire, in the hostages imprisoned in the Tower, and in the suspicion and resentment that defined English politics for a generation. Their affair, such as it was, reminds us that power without accountability, desire without restraint, and obsession without consequence can bring down even the mightiest of kingdoms, and that some secrets, once sealed in the Tower, should perhaps remain there forever, serving as a warning to all who would confuse the throne with a tool for personal gratification rather than public service.